Hey there, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning into this live stream on the channel Equipped, on this channel Equipped. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm going to share with you some things about interpreting the prophets of the Old Testament. Now, I'm doing this in part because I've got a teaching series that I'm doing about how. No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was my daughter. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I've got a series right now on how to interpret the prophet Joel. I'm going to be going passage by passage in the prophet Joel, and that's already available right now. If you go to my YouTube channel, in fact, let's go ahead and check that out right now. Let me see. I can't show you that right now, but if you go to my YouTube channel, there's a series, and the first video in that series is an introduction, an overview introduction to the book of the prophet Joel. And so coming out this Wednesday, January the 2nd, will be the first actual passage study that I do. And I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm looking at the first passage, which is Joel chapter 1, verses 2 through 12, but I'm breaking it up into paragraphs. And so I'm doing one paragraph at a time, and I'm experimenting with the format. So I'd love to hear some feedback from you. If it takes too long, or I don't know, maybe we need to advance a bit more quickly, I'd love for you to let me know about that. But anyway, check out that video. You can go to my YouTube channel right now and you can set a reminder for yourself, because that video is already up. You can't watch it, but you can set a reminder so that you can see it as soon as it becomes available. But what I want to share with you right now, it has to do with interpreting the prophets in general. I feel that there is I don't want to call it a fear, but a hesitation in general among people in the church about going into the books of the Old Testament, the prophetic books of the Old Testament, and interpreting them or reading them or even using them for the devotional. And I think there's a misconception about these prophetic books, that they're difficult to understand, that they're mysterious, that you have to have a Bible school degree in order to understand them correctly. And that's, in my opinion, that's not at all the case. And so in this video, I want to share with you a couple of tips. Now, there's a whole lot more than what I'm going to share in this video, but I do want to share with you a couple of tips on interpreting the prophets of the Old Testament, because there is so much beauty, and they're just fantastic books, absolutely fantastic books. And if you take the opportunity to dive in there and find out what they're about, there's so much benefit and profit in reading the prophets of the Old Testament. So I want to demystify the prophets of the Old Testament, because they are understandable. Understanding them it's within our reach to understand them. But let me share with you a couple of things that I think is helpful when it comes to interpreting the prophets of the Old Testament. Now, I'm just going to draw this out. I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think this will be helpful. A misconception that I think a lot of people have when it comes to interpreting the prophets of the Old Testament is this. I'm going to draw a little timeline right here. Let me see. This is a timeline, okay? And I'm going to put the cross right here. This is the cross. We'll just put beginning over here. And we're going to say that over here is the end times, okay? What we call eschatology, the end times over here. And I think, and I'm going to write the prophets, we're talking about books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, all those books. I think there's a conception that these prophetic books over here are all about the end times over here. That when you go to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and those prophetic books of the Old Testament, that really what they're talking about is everything that's going to happen over here. Sure, they have some prophecies about Jesus and about his ministry, but the prophets are all about the end times. And so that's so mysterious. It's so difficult to understand because, we've got the book of Revelation, we've got the book of Daniel, and so you throw in there the books of the prophets, and then the day of the Lord in the book of Joel, because that's a big theme in the book of Joel, the day of the Lord, and you just throw all these things in there. And I think there's a misconception that because the prophets of the Old Testament are all about the end times, you need a degree in prophecy just to understand them. And I'm going to tell you that it is a misconception that that's what the prophets are all about. The prophets are not all about the end times. are there prophecies? Are there sections in the prophets of the Old Testament that do talk about apocalyptic information? That meaning the end of the world type of stuff. Yeah, sure, definitely, there are. But I would say that that's a very small percentage, a very small percentage of the material of the Old Testament prophets has to do with the apocalypse, with end time events. The bulk of the events that the prophets prophesy or talk about really have nothing to do with the end time. So this is the first tip that I want to share with you, that understand that the prophets, I'm going to write this out here, are not, underline that, all about the end of the world. Let me just write that out there. That's tip number one. If you can understand that, if you can just get that understanding that the prophets are not all about the end of the world, you've done yourself a huge favor. Number one, you've probably just immediately demystified the difficulty of the prophets, because I really think that there is a sense that people have that the prophets are so difficult because they deal with the end times, and I have to know about prophetic literature and apocalyptic literature and symbolism and the 7 weeks of Daniel. And no. There is some of that in there, but again, I'm going to say that the bulk of it, of the Old Testament prophets, really don't deal with the end times. Now, you might disagree with me. If you do, let me know in the comments and we can have a discussion about that. But I really think that that is a huge misconception that a lot of people have about the Old Testament prophets, that it's all about the end times. Not true. So just, if you understand that one tip, that's going to do wonders for you for demystifying the Old Testament prophets and getting in there and studying them. Okay, so if they don't have to do with the end times, what are they about? Well, this is where we come to tip number 2. And I'm going to go back to the screen and I'm going to draw another timeline down here, okay? But this time, I'm going to put the cross right here. Here's the cross. Here's Jesus, right? Here's the beginning. And I'm going to put the prophets, let me see, right here. Okay. In fact, let me do something. Let me make a correction here. All right. I'm going to erase the cross. I'm going to put the cross right here, and I'm going to put us right here. Okay. This is us today. Okay. So this is huge when understanding the prophets. The prophets are prophesying events, for the most part, that even take place before the coming of Christ. Now, let me say again that there are some prophecies that deal with the coming of Christ. Of course, without a doubt. But the bulk of the Old Testament prophets, okay, they have to do with events that have to do with Israel's history, with events that took place in Israel's history. So here's tip number 2, okay, for understanding the Old Testament prophets. Here's the tip. I'm going to put tip number 2 here. What's in the future for the prophets, it's really in the past for us. They're looking forward. God had given them this unique insight to see things that were coming in the future according to Israel's history or Israel's timeline. Most of the prophecies that they were talking about already took place. So for us today, they're in the past. Because the prophets, they're really talking about events that were relevant for the people of Israel at that time. And again, not all about end time events. So what was in the future for the prophets, for the most part, is in the past for us. And if you can understand that, again, that's a huge key for understanding the prophets of the Old Testament. If you can just understand that, then again, it's demystified, right? It's not this mysterious blob of books that, we should stay away from and just let the pastors and the preachers, let's let them deal with it. Let's let them read from them, and maybe they'll preach on it from time to time, and I'll understand it a little bit. But no. It's for us. I'm of the firm belief that God didn't give us his word to hide it from us. Does it require study? Does it require our investment of time? Absolutely it does. But any one of us can understand any passage from any book in the Bible. I firmly believe that, and that's a huge reason of why I do these teachings on this channel, because I want to equip you to do that. That's where the name comes from too, right? I want to equip you to have that sense, that feeling that, well, I can interpret the Bible for myself. Absolutely you can. And so demystifying the prophets, if you can learn just a little bit of Old Testament history and events that took place in the Old Testament and understand that a major portion of the events that the prophets were prophesying about already took place from our vantage point in history, they already took place. They were in the future for the prophets. They were in the future for the people of Israel. But from our vantage point, the bulk of them, they already took place. Stuff like the coming of the Assyrians, stuff like the coming of the Babylonians, of the Persians, even of the Greeks. That stuff, the prophets were seeing into the future and prophesying into the future about those kinds of things that already took place in Israel's history. From our vantage point, it already took place. It's in the past. But for the prophets and for the people they were speaking to, that stuff was still in the future. So if that again, that demystifies, in my opinion, that's huge for demystifying this mystery around the prophets, that they're just so difficult to understand because it's all about the end. No. Most of the stuff that they prophesied has already taken place. And you do yourself a huge favor. We do ourselves a huge favor by learning just a little bit of Old Testament history, events, major events that took place in Old Testament history, and then putting the prophets in the appropriate place, historically speaking, and then their messages, oh man, they just come to life. And in fact, I'll put a link in the description because I did a video on an overview of Old Testament history, and I went through and I put the prophets where they belong historically. I wasn't tremendously precise about it, but I went in there and I said, hey, here's where they belong, roughly speaking, here's where the prophets are. So again, if you can understand just some major basic events that took place in Old Testament history, in the history of the people of Israel, that is huge for understanding the messages of the prophets. So those are the two tips that I want to leave with you. Now, in the future on this channel, I'm going to do a more elaborate teaching on tips and keys and principles for interpreting and understanding prophetic literature. But I felt that these two were huge, big enough that I wanted to share that with you right now in this live session. So again, what are the two tips that I want to leave with you? The first one is that the prophets are not all about the end of the world. That's not what they're all about. Are there portions of them that talk about that? Absolutely, but that's not what the bulk of the message is about in the prophets. Tip number 2, most of what the prophets talked about was in the future for them, but now it's in the past for us. And learning a little bit of Old Testament history will go a long way to helping us understand the message of the prophets. So I hope that helps you out. I hope, again, probably the biggest thing is that it would help demystify the difficulty that surrounds interpreting prophetic literature of the Old Testament. I do a Facebook Live session every Saturday evening between 7:30 and 8:30. It kind of varies depending on what my family has going on throughout the day. But I do a Facebook Live session, not Facebook, a YouTube Live session every Saturday around this time, just to give you some additional tips and teachings and stuff like this, like I did today. But there's a new video on this channel every Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the morning. It's available. And there's one coming up this Wednesday on Joel chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, which is part of a larger teaching of Joel chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. I hope you join me for that. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing. This channel is all about helping you deepen your understanding of the Word of God, whether it's for your personal edification or because you have that great responsibility of sharing God's Word with others. Thank you so much for joining me in this live session. God bless you. See you next time.